They stormed the beaches. They liberated concentration camps. They fought Hitler's army with courage that shook the world. Yet their names were buried, their medals hidden, their sacrifices forgotten. This is the story of the black soldiers who saved Europe and the conspiracy of silence that tried to erase them forever. If this story moves you, if it makes you angry, if it opens your eyes, don't let it end here. Hit that subscribe button and share this video. These heroes deserve to be remembered. Let's make sure their story never gets buried again. When we think of World War II, certain images flash through our minds. Soldiers storming Normandy beach, pilots dogfighting in European skies, tank commanders crushing the Nazi war machine. But there's something missing from these pictures. Someone missing. And that absence isn't an accident. It's the result of one of the most deliberate erasures in modern history. Today, we're going to uncover a truth that was buried for 70 years. A truth about courage, sacrifice, and betrayal. This isn't just a forgotten chapter of history. This is a story that was actively hidden, systematically suppressed, and intentionally destroyed. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why. Picture America in 1941. The nation is reeling from Pearl Harbor. Young men across the country are lining up to enlist, ready to fight fascism and defend freedom. But for one group of Americans, that fight for freedom carried a bitter irony. Black Americans couldn't drink from the same water fountains as white Americans. They couldn't eat in the same restaurants, attend the same schools, or even use the same bathrooms. In the South, they lived under the constant threat of violence and lynching. And yet, when their country called them to fight against tyranny abroad, they answered. They answered by the thousands, by the hundreds of thousands. Young black men volunteered to fight for a nation that treated them as second-class citizens. They knew the contradiction. They felt it every single day. But they believed that perhaps, just perhaps, if they proved their valor on the battlefield, if they bled for their country, if they showed the world what they were capable of, things might change back home. It was a hope that would be brutally crushed. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The military didn't want them. Not really. When black soldiers were finally allowed to serve in combat roles, they were segregated into all-black units, commanded mostly by white officers who often didn't believe in them. They trained with inferior equipment. They were given the worst assignments. They were told, sometimes directly, and sometimes through every small humiliation, that they weren't good enough, that they weren't smart enough, that they didn't have what it took to fight Hitler's armies. But those soldiers took every insult, every obstacle, every closed door, and they turned it into fuel. They were about to prove something that would terrify the American establishment. November 1944. France. The 761st Tank Battalion rolled into combat with a motto that would define them: "Come out fighting." These were black tankers, trained to operate Sherman tanks in the brutal mechanized warfare that defined the European theater. General George Patton himself addressed them before their first mission. He told them they would get their chance to prove themselves. What he didn't tell them was that the Army had already decided to bury their achievements, no matter how spectacular they might be. And spectacular they were. The 761st Tank Battalion fought for 183 consecutive days. They participated in the Battle of the Bulge, one of the bloodiest engagements of the entire war. They were among the first American units to link up with Soviet forces. They liberated towns across France, Belgium, and Germany. They faced the same artillery, the same machine gun fire, the same terrifying Tiger tanks that every Allied soldier feared. And they didn't just survive. They excelled. White soldiers who fought alongside them wrote letters home describing their bravery. German prisoners of war expressed shock at facing black American tankers. The 761st was a revelation on the battlefield. But while they were fighting, something else was happening. Photographers were present at many of their engagements. The military documented everything, as it always did. But those photographs, those after-action reports, those commendations, they started disappearing, being filed away in places where they'd never see the light of day. Because back in Washington, military brass and government officials were already worried about what would happen when these soldiers came home. Would they still accept segregation after proving themselves equal to any white soldier? Would they demand the rights they'd earned with their blood? The answer to both questions was yes. And that terrified the people in power. While the 761st was fighting on the ground, another group of black soldiers was dominating the air, the Tuskegee Airmen. These pilots underwent training at a segregated airfield in Alabama, facing hostility from local communities and skepticism from the military. They were told that black men lacked the intelligence and reflexes to fly fighter planes. It was considered scientific fact by many white officers. The Tuskegee Airmen were about to make those officers look like fools. Flying their distinctive red-tailed P-51 Mustangs, the Tuskegee Airmen escorted American bombers on missions deep into Nazi territory. Bomber crews dreaded these missions. German fighters would attack in waves, and Allied losses were catastrophic. But when the Red Tails flew escort, something remarkable happened. The bombers came home, again and again and again. The Tuskegee Airmen compiled a record that no other fighter group could match. They never lost a bomber to enemy fighters. Not one. White bomber crews specifically requested the Red Tails as their escorts. In the sky, where skill and courage were the only things that mattered, these black pilots proved they were the best. Their commanding officer, Benjamin Davis, Jr., became one of the most respected fighter commanders in the entire European theater. His pilots shot down over 100 enemy aircraft. They destroyed countless ground targets. They flew more than 15,000 sorties. And when the war ended, the military tried to pretend it never happened. Davis was passed over for promotions. His pilots returned to an America where they couldn't even get jobs as commercial pilots because of their skin color. The same country that had depended on their skill to protect its bombers now refused to acknowledge what they'd accomplished. April 1945. American forces were pushing deep into Germany, and they began discovering something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Concentration camps, the industrial machinery of the Holocaust, and among the first American soldiers to liberate these camps were black troops. They walked through the gates of Buchenwald, of Dachau, and they saw horrors that no human being should ever witness. Skeletal prisoners who could barely stand, mass graves, gas chambers, the full evidence of Nazi genocide. The black soldiers who liberated these camps felt a connection to the prisoners that white soldiers couldn't fully understand. These were people who had been dehumanized, marked as inferior, systematically murdered because of who they were. The black soldiers knew what it meant to be considered less than human. They knew what it meant to live under a system that wanted to destroy you. And so they wept. They gave the prisoners their own rations. They carried survivors who couldn't walk. They documented the atrocities, knowing that the world needed to see what hatred could produce. Holocaust survivors remembered their black liberators for the rest of their lives. Decades later, some would track down the soldiers who had freed them, traveling across oceans to thank them personally. They remembered the kindness in those soldiers' eyes, the gentle way they lifted starving prisoners, the fury they showed toward the Nazi guards. But for decades, the official history of the concentration camp liberations barely mentioned black soldiers. The photographs of black troops at the camps were kept in archives. The narrative had to be controlled. The liberators of Europe, the story went, were white. Anything else complicated the myth. The war ended. Hitler was defeated. The Nazi regime collapsed. And the black soldiers who had fought so courageously began the long journey home. They expected parades, recognition, perhaps even gratitude. What they got instead was a nightmare. They returned to an America that hadn't changed, that refused to change. In the South, black soldiers were beaten for wearing their uniforms in public. They were told to get to the back of buses. They were refused service at restaurants. Some were lynched, still in uniform, for daring to believe they deserved respect. The GI Bill, which gave white veterans access to home loans, college education, and business opportunities, was systematically denied to black veterans. Banks wouldn't give them loans. Colleges wouldn't accept them. The law said they were entitled to these benefits, but the reality was different. And so the very soldiers who had saved Europe came home to poverty, discrimination, and violence. They watched white veterans build prosperous lives with government help, while they were locked out of the American dream they'd fought to protect. Some of these veterans became leaders in the civil rights movement. They'd seen what was possible. They'd lived in French towns where people treated them as equals. They'd fought alongside white soldiers who respected their courage. They knew that segregation wasn't natural or inevitable. It was a choice, and they began to fight against it. But for many, the betrayal was too deep. They grew bitter. They tried to forget their service. They rarely spoke about the war, even to their own children. The pain of being erased from history was too great. But the erasure was only beginning. In Hollywood, war movies became a booming industry. Films about World War II dominated the box office for decades, and in almost every single one of them, the soldiers were white. The pilots were white. The heroes were white. Directors knew that black soldiers had fought. Studios had access to the historical record. But they made a choice, a deliberate, calculated choice. They would tell the story of World War II as if black soldiers had barely participated, as if their contribution had been minimal, as if the war had been won by white courage alone. History textbooks followed suit. Children learned about D-Day, but not about the black soldiers who stormed those beaches. They learned about the liberation of concentration camps, but not about the black troops who opened the gates. They learned about the air war, but the Tuskegee Airmen were a footnote, if they were mentioned at all. An entire generation grew up believing that World War II was a whites-only war. This wasn't an oversight. This was policy. The military itself participated in this erasure. Medals that should have gone to black soldiers were never awarded. When recommendations for the Medal of Honor were submitted for black soldiers, they mysteriously stalled in the bureaucracy. Photographs were misfiled or lost. After-action reports were edited or suppressed. The official history of American military heroism was being whitewashed in real time, and almost no one was willing to challenge it. Why? Because acknowledging the full contribution of black soldiers would undermine the entire system of segregation and white supremacy that defined post-war America. If black soldiers could fight as well as white soldiers, could fly as well, could lead as well, then what justification was there for treating them as inferior? There was none, and that truth was too dangerous to allow. Decades passed. The soldiers grew old. Many died without ever receiving recognition for what they'd done. But some historians began digging. They went into military archives and found the reports that had been buried. They interviewed surviving soldiers and recorded their stories. They tracked down the photographs that had been hidden away. And slowly, painfully, the truth began to emerge. In 1997, more than 50 years after the end of World War II, President Bill Clinton finally awarded the Medal of Honor to 7 black soldiers from the war. 7. Out of the 443 Medals of Honor awarded for World War II, only 7 had gone to black soldiers. And even those 7 weren't awarded until most of the recipients were dead. Only one, Vernon Baker, was still alive to receive his medal in person. He was 77 years old. He'd waited more than half a century for recognition that should have come immediately. The Tuskegee Airmen finally received recognition in the form of a Congressional Gold Medal in 2007. The surviving pilots, now in their 80s and 90s, attended the ceremony. Some wept. Some were simply grateful that the truth was finally being acknowledged. But many were angry. Recognition after 60 years felt hollow. Where was the recognition when they needed it? When they couldn't get jobs? When they were refused housing? When they were trying to build lives in a country that despised them? The honor came too late for thousands of their fellow airmen who had died in obscurity. This isn't just a story about the past. This is about how history gets written and who gets to write it. It's about how power protects itself by controlling memory. For 70 years, America told itself a lie about World War II, a lie that was comfortable, a lie that reinforced the racial hierarchy that white America wanted to maintain. And that lie had consequences. It meant that generations of black Americans grew up without knowing about the heroes in their own community. It meant that white Americans never had to confront the cognitive dissonance of honoring black soldiers while supporting segregation. It meant that the true story of American courage was suppressed to serve a political agenda. But the truth has a way of surviving. Those soldiers didn't fight for recognition. They fought because they believed in something bigger than themselves. They fought because they hoped the world could change. And in the end, they were right. The civil rights movement drew strength from their example. The slow dismantling of segregation was built on the foundation they laid. Every time a black soldier in that war is finally honored, every time their story is told, we chip away at the lie that was constructed to erase them. These men fought for a country that refused to fight for them. They bled for a nation that wouldn't even let them drink from the same water fountains. They saved Europe from fascism and came home to American apartheid. Their medals were denied. Their photographs were hidden. Their stories were suppressed. But they were there, in the skies over Germany, in the tanks rolling through France, at the gates of the concentration camps. They were there, and they were magnificent. Their names deserve to be remembered. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Stewart, Tuskegee Airman, who flew over 40 combat missions. Sergeant Edward Carter, who single-handedly took out multiple enemy positions in Germany. Captain Charles Thomas, who led his men despite being shot multiple times. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers, who continued fighting even after losing his leg. These are just a few. There are thousands more, thousands of heroes whose names you'll never find in history books. Subscribe to this channel and help spread their story. Comment below with the name of one hero you learned about today. Share this video with someone who needs to know the truth. Let's honor these soldiers by making sure their names echo through history. Their story isn't just black history. It's American history. It's human history. And it's time the whole world knew it. Because history isn't what happened. History is what we choose to remember. And today, we choose to remember them.